The orbital station called Axiom Prime floated in the empty dark between two dying stars. It was the largest military academy in the known galaxy, a place where the finest officers of over 400 species came to prove themselves. Its halls were wide enough for creatures the size of buildings to walk through. Its war rooms held technology that could simulate entire galaxies at war. And every 10 years, it hosted the most important military competition in existence, the Grand Simulation. Commander Thylak Vorson stood at the tall window of his office and watched the transport ships arrive. His insect-like body was still, his 4 arms folded behind his back, and his dark compound eyes reflected the lights of the incoming vessels. He was the head proctor of the academy, responsible for running the Grand Simulation, and he had done this job 3 times before without worry. But today, his mandibles clicked together in a pattern his species only made when they sensed danger. Today, the humans were coming. He turned away from the window and looked at the list on his display. 16 species had sent teams. The Velthari Hive Command, his own people, were the favorites. They held the all-time record for completing the simulation, 4.2 galactic years, roughly 6 days in real time. The reptilian Draxi warlords were always strong. The soft-spoken Urani were clever with diplomacy. All of them had sent large delegations, 30 to 50 officers each, as was tradition. Earth had sent 6 people. 6. Vorson's mandibles clicked again. He pulled up the file on the human team leader, Captain Mara Voss, 34 years old, former soldier in something called the United States Marine Corps. Her service record was short by galactic standards but filled with words that made his translator struggle: combat deployment, urban warfare, counterinsurgency. He did not fully understand what all of these meant, but the tone of the documents was clear. This woman had spent most of her adult life learning how to end lives. He closed the file and walked to the briefing hall. The hall was already full when he arrived. Delegations from every species filled the curved rows of seats, their translators humming softly as dozens of languages overlapped. The Draxi sat in their heavy armor, tails curled around their seats. The Urani delegation shimmered with the wet shine of their amphibian skin. The Velthari officers sat in perfect formation, still as stones. And in the back row, almost lost among the larger species, sat the humans. Vorson studied them as he walked to the podium. Captain Voss sat in the center, her posture straight but relaxed. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching the chest of most species in the room. Her skin was a warm brown, her dark hair pulled back tight, and her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in everything and everyone. She did not look nervous. She did not look excited. She looked like someone counting the exits. Next to her sat a thin, dark-skinned man who seemed to take up no space at all. His file identified him as Sergeant First Class Elijah M. Wangi, but his team called him Ghost. He did not look at anyone. He looked at the holographic map of the simulation zone that floated above the podium, and his eyes moved across it the way a predator's eyes moved across open ground. The third human was a young woman with a wide smile who was talking cheerfully to a Urani officer beside her. The Urani looked deeply uncomfortable. This was Corporal Priya Shankar, the team's combat engineer. Her file said she had built field bridges under enemy fire and had once repaired a fusion reactor with wire and tape. She laughed at something the Urani said, and the alien flinched. Vorson reached the podium and activated the display. The room fell silent. "Welcome to the 32nd Grand Simulation," he said, his translated voice filling the hall. "You represent the finest military minds of your species. Over the coming days, you will face the Harrow contingency, a simulated galactic war against an adaptive enemy known as the Scourge Tide." The holographic map expanded, showing a galaxy filled with red zones and flashing threat markers. Vorson explained the rules. Each team would command a fleet and a set of worlds. The Scourge Tide, controlled by the most advanced war AI ever built, would attack from all sides. It would learn. It would adapt. It would get stronger with every passing year of simulated time. The simulation covered 10 years of warfare. No team had ever completed it in less than 6 real-time days. Most teams lasted 2 to 3 weeks. Some never finished at all. Your starting positions have been assigned by random selection, Vorsan said, though everyone in the room knew the selection was not entirely random. When the positions appeared on the display, the room reacted. The Velthari had received a strong central position with good supply lines. The Draxi had a fortified sector with natural chokepoints. The Urani had a cluster of allied worlds. The humans had been given the Rim sector, a scattered collection of poorly defended border worlds on the edge of Scourge territory. It was, by any measure, the worst position in the simulation. The kind of position that was given to teams no one expected to survive the first simulated year. A low murmur passed through the hall. Some of it was sympathetic, most of it was not. Vorsan watched the humans carefully. He expected frustration, perhaps anger, perhaps a formal complaint. Captain Voss looked at the map. She tilted her head slightly. Then she leaned over to Ghost and whispered something. Ghost studied the map for 3 seconds, then nodded once. Shankar glanced at the map, shrugged, and went back to trying to make conversation with the terrified Urani beside her. That was it, no complaint, no reaction, just a whisper, a nod, and a shrug. In the front row, Ambassador Yilin of the Urani watched the humans with her wide, membrane-covered eyes. She was the diplomat who had fought to bring Earth into the Galactic Union 5 years ago. She had told the Council that humans were spirited but manageable. She had believed it at the time. Now, watching Voss study that terrible map position with the calm focus of a surgeon examining a patient, she was not so sure. After the briefing, the delegations filed out to prepare for the next day's simulation. Vorsan stood at the podium and watched the humans leave. Voss walked with an easy stride, her small team around her like a fist. She paused at the door and looked back at the holographic map one more time. She smiled. It was a small smile, quick and sharp, and it disappeared as fast as it came. But Vorsan saw it, and something old and deep in his insect brain, something from a time before his species had built cities or sailed between stars, told him to be afraid. High Arbiter Draylon, the ancient tree-like elder who had judged simulations for 200 years, stood in the shadows of the gallery above. He had watched every moment. He had seen every team that had ever walked into this hall. He had seen confidence, arrogance, fear, and determination in 1,000 forms. He had never seen what he saw in the eyes of Captain Mara Voss. It was not confidence. Confidence was hoping you would win. What he saw in the human's eyes was something far older and far more dangerous. It was certainty. He settled his ancient roots into the floor and prepared himself. Tomorrow, he suspected, was going to be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. He was right, but even he could not have guessed how right he was. The Grand Simulation Chamber was a cathedral of war. It sat deep in the heart of Axiom Prime, a circular room large enough to hold a starship, with 16 raised command platforms arranged around a central holographic display the size of a small moon. Each platform held a team and their equipment. Above them, a glass-walled gallery allowed hundreds of observers to watch every move. The chamber hummed with energy as the 16 teams took their positions. Officers adjusted their displays, checked their fleet assignments, and spoke in low, focused voices. The Velthari moved with mechanical precision, their insect bodies clicking as they arranged themselves in their famous diamond formation, a command structure they had used for 1,000 years. The Draxi growled orders at each other, their heavy tails thumping the floor as they prepared defensive strategies. The Urani murmured together in their wet, musical language, already planning which simulated factions they would try to turn into allies. On Platform 16, the furthest from the center and the smallest in the room, the 6 humans set up their equipment in silence. Voss stood at the main display. Ghost sat behind her at a secondary console. Shankar crouched under the platform's power unit and made adjustments no one had asked her to make. The other three members of the team, Lieutenant Park, Specialist Okafor, and Sergeant Reeves, took their positions without a word. They did not speak because they did not need to. They had trained together for 2 years. They communicated in glances, nods, and the small movements of hands. High Arbiter Draylan activated the simulation from his seat in the gallery. His deep, wooden voice echoed through the chamber. The Harrow contingency begins now. The central holographic display exploded into light. A galaxy appeared, billions of stars, thousands of habitable worlds, and spreading across the eastern spiral arm like a dark stain, the scourge tide. Red markers showed enemy fleets, enemy bases, enemy factory worlds churning out warships. The scale was staggering. This was not a small battle. This was a war that spanned light years, and the AI that controlled the enemy had been designed by the greatest minds of 12 species over 40 years. It learned, it adapted, it did not make the same mistake twice. The teams began to move. The Velthari launched their opening strategy, a careful, methodical advance along 3 axes, supported by supply lines and reserve fleets. It was elegant and efficient. The Draxi fortified their sector, building layered defenses that would take years to break through. The Urani sent diplomatic envoys to neutral simulated civilizations, building a coalition. On Platform 16, the humans did nothing. Minutes passed, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. The human display remained nearly dark. No fleet movements, no orders issued, no strategy visible. In the gallery, observers began to whisper. A Draxi general laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "The Deathworlders are frozen," he said to his aide. "The scale has overwhelmed them. Their little predator brains cannot process a war this large." Commander Vorsan watched from the Proctor's station. He did not laugh. He studied the human platform with his compound eyes and noticed something the others missed. The humans were not frozen. Their hands were moving. Voss was entering commands, hundreds of them, but they were not fleet orders. They were small, targeted queries sent directly into the simulation's framework. She was poking the enemy AI, testing it, sending single ships on suicide runs into Scourge space and watching how the AI responded. She was not playing the game. She was reading the game's mind. Ghost sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on a scrolling wall of data that no one else in the room would have been able to read at that speed. He was tracking every response the Scourge AI made to Voss's probes, building a map of its decision-making patterns in his head. Every 3 seconds, he tapped a single key, feeding one line of analysis to Voss. Under the platform, Shankar had finished her modifications to the power unit. She climbed out, dusted her hands on her uniform, and began rewriting their fleet's energy allocation system. Standard Galactic doctrine divided a fleet's power equally between weapons, shields, and engines. Shankar deleted the entire system and rebuilt it from scratch. She gave 60% to engines, 30% to weapons, and 10% to shields. Lieutenant Park, watching over her shoulder, raised an eyebrow. 10% shields. Shankar grinned. Can't get hit if they can't catch you. At the 11-minute mark, the gallery had grown bored of the humans. Attention had shifted to the Velthari, who were making their usual strong opening, and the Draxi, whose defensive fortress was already taking shape. A few observers glanced at Platform 16 with pity. The humans had wasted their opening. They would spend the rest of the simulation trying to catch up. At the 12-minute mark, Captain Mara Voss straightened her back, looked at Ghost, and said one word. Now, what happened next would be talked about for 100 years. Every ship in the human fleet moved at once, not in formation, not along planned routes. They scattered like shrapnel from a bomb, each ship or group of ships racing toward a different target at speeds the simulation had never seen from player-controlled vessels. Shankar's engine modifications had turned their standard fleet into the fastest force in the galaxy. Voss hit the Scourge on 3 fronts simultaneously. But she did not attack the way the simulation expected. She did not target military bases or enemy fleets. She targeted the connections between them, the supply routes, the communication relays, the refueling stations. She cut the Scourge's body into pieces before she started killing the pieces. On the first front, she sent a squadron of fast corvettes directly into a Scourge sensor network. They did not fight the defense fleet. They flew past it, too fast to catch, and destroyed the sensors behind it. The Scourge defense fleet was suddenly blind. On the second front, Ghost directed a wave of converted cargo ships, civilian vessels that Shankar had quietly loaded with mining explosives, into a Scourge factory world's orbit. They detonated in a pattern that created a debris field so dense that nothing could enter or leave the planet. The factory was not destroyed. It was imprisoned. On the third front, Voss did something that made the Velthari proctor on duty physically step back from his console. She ordered her communications team to flood every Scourge frequency with noise, not jamming signals, but random data, billions of lines of meaningless information. The Scourge AI had to process all of it to check for real communications hidden inside. For 45 simulated seconds, the most advanced war AI in the galaxy was forced to waste its processing power reading nonsense. In those 45 seconds, Voss's main battle group tore through the weakened Scourge line and captured 2 star systems. The simulation clock jumped. Simulated year 1 passed. Then year 2. The human display, dark and quiet just minutes ago, now blazed with movement, territory markers, and flashing victory indicators. The gallery had gone completely silent. Commander Vorson stared at the human display. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound his species had not made in 10,000 years of civilization. It was the sound his ancestors made in the dark forests of their homeworld when they smelled something at the top of the food chain. The Draxi general who had laughed was no longer laughing. He stood at the gallery railing, his clawed hands gripping the metal so hard it bent. High Arbiter Draylon leaned forward in his seat. In 200 years of judging simulations, he had never leaned forward. On Platform 16, Voss did not celebrate. She did not pause. She looked at the map, looked at Ghost, and said, "Phase 2, let's pick up the pace." Ghost nodded. Across the chamber, on Platform 1, the Velthari Hive commander turned to Vorson's second-in-command and asked a question that had never been asked in the history of the grand simulation. Is it permitted to stop our own campaign and simply watch theirs? The answer was yes. Within 10 minutes, 3 more teams had done the same. The humans did not notice. They were busy. By the 25th minute, the gallery above the simulation chamber was full. Word had spread through Axiom Prime like fire through dry grass. Officers, cadets, diplomats, engineers, and even kitchen staff had abandoned their duties and crowded into the observation deck. Some stood on chairs. Some climbed onto each other's shoulders. A Koreth botanist who had never watched a war game in her life was pressed against the glass, her wooden fingers gripping the railing, unable to look away. Below them, on the central holographic display, the human campaign burned across the galaxy like a spreading wound. Blue markers, the human forces, had consumed nearly 40% of the Scourge Tide's territory. The red stain that had once dominated the eastern spiral arm was breaking apart, collapsing inward, fragmenting into isolated pockets of resistance. The simulation clock read year 5. No team in the history of the grand simulation had reached year 5 in under 2 real-time days. The humans had reached it in 25 minutes. On Platform 16, there was no celebration. Voss stood at her display with the same focused calm she had carried since the beginning. Ghost fed her data in short, clipped sentences. Shankar hummed a song under her breath as she recalibrated their fleet's weapons systems for the 3rd time. The rest of the team worked in smooth, practiced silence. But something was changing. The Scourge Tide AI had been designed to learn. For the first 4 simulated years, it had been caught off guard. The human tactics were so far outside its programming that it could not predict or counter them. But the AI was built to adapt. And now it began to do exactly that. It studied the human patterns. It analyzed their speed, their aggression, their willingness to sacrifice ships for strategic gain, and it began to fight back. Scourge fleets that had been retreating suddenly turned and attacked with new formations. Factory worlds that had been blockaded began producing a new class of warship, faster, more heavily armed, designed specifically to counter the human fleet's speed advantage. Communication networks that had been disrupted rebuilt themselves with encryption the humans had not seen before. The Scourge tide was evolving. In the gallery, a ripple of grim satisfaction passed through the veteran observers. This was the wall. This was where every team that had ever performed well in the simulation hit their limit. The AI's adaptive phase was designed to be overwhelming. It turned the enemy's own success against them by learning from every battle it lost. The Velthari had hit this wall during their record run and spent 4 real-time days grinding through it. The Draxi had hit it and never recovered. The Urani had hit it and surrendered. Ghost saw it coming before anyone else. He had been tracking the AI's behavioral shifts since the simulation began, and at the 26th minute, he leaned forward and spoke his first full sentence of the day. "It is adapting to our speed and aggression. It is building counters. Within 2 simulated months, it will be able to match our fleet movements." Voss nodded. She had expected this. She turned to her team and said, "New doctrine. I am calling it controlled annihilation. Here is what we are going to do." What she described next made several alien military theorists in the gallery feel physically sick. First, she ordered a retreat. Not a fighting retreat, not a strategic withdrawal, a full, visible, obvious retreat from 2-star systems her forces had captured in the early push. She pulled every ship out and left the systems undefended. The Scourge AI, seeing an opportunity, rushed in to reclaim them. Its adaptive algorithms recorded this as a success. The humans were vulnerable to counterattack. The humans could be pushed back. The AI adjusted its entire strategic model around this new information. This was exactly what Voss wanted. She had fed the AI false data. She had shown it a weakness that did not exist, and the AI had believed it because the AI was designed to learn from what it observed. It could not imagine that a commander would deliberately lose territory as a trick. No species in the history of the simulation had ever done this, because no species thought of war as something you could lose on purpose. Second, she split her remaining forces into 8 independent groups, each commanded by a member of her team with full authority to make their own decisions. This was unheard of. Every alien military doctrine in the galaxy was built on hierarchy. Orders flowed from the top down, and no subordinate acted without approval. The idea of giving a sergeant the same command authority as a captain in the middle of a war was, to most species, insanity. But humans were not most species. Humans had spent thousands of years fighting wars on a world where communication could fail at any moment, where officers died and sergeants had to become generals overnight, where the soldier on the ground often knew more about the battle than the commander behind the lines. They had built their entire military philosophy around a simple idea: trust the person closest to the problem. The 8 human groups spread across the galaxy like the fingers of an opening hand. Each one operated independently, hitting different targets, using different tactics, adapting to local conditions without waiting for orders. The Scourge AI, which had just recalibrated itself to fight a single, centralized enemy, suddenly faced 8 different enemies fighting 8 different wars. Third, and this was the part that made the aliens sick, Voss revealed what she had done to the 2 systems she had surrendered. Shankar had rigged them. In the hours of simulated time between the human conquest and the human retreat, Shankar's engineering teams had buried devices deep in the planet's crusts. They had destabilized orbital mechanics, planted gravity generators in asteroid fields, and turned the system's own stars into weapons, by positioning reflective satellites that could focus solar energy into concentrated beams. When the Scourge fleets poured into the two systems to reclaim them, celebrating their victory, Voss gave a single order. The systems came alive. Gravity wells twisted and tore at Scourge ships. Asteroid fields collapsed inward like closing jaws. Focused solar beams cut through hull armor like hot wire through plastic. The Scourge lost more ships in those two systems in 10 simulated minutes than they had lost in the entire previous 4 years of the war. The gallery erupted. Aliens shouted in a dozen languages. A Velthari officer dropped his data tablet. The Draxi general, who had been watching in stunned silence since the 12-minute mark, slammed his fist on the railing and roared not in anger, but in something closer to religious awe. But the most significant reaction came from the Scourge AI itself. It retreated. Not a tactical withdrawal from one sector, not a repositioning of forces. The Scourge tide pulled every ship, every station, every asset out of the entire northwestern quadrant of the galaxy and fell back behind its core defensive lines. The simulations programmers were called to the chamber. They ran diagnostics on the AI, checked its code, verified its decision trees. Everything was functioning correctly. The AI had simply calculated that engaging the humans in open territory had a 0% survival probability. It had concluded that the only rational response was to abandon a quarter of the galaxy and consolidate. In 200 years, the Scourge AI had never retreated from an entire quadrant. It had been designed to be relentless, to always push forward, to never give ground willingly. The humans had not just beaten it, they had taught it fear. Ambassador Yilin sat in the gallery with her hands pressed against her face. Her membrane-covered eyes were wide and wet. A colleague from the Urani diplomatic corps leaned over and whispered, "Are you all right?" Yilin lowered her hands slowly. "I brought them into the Union," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I told the Council they were spirited but manageable. I said they would be good allies." She looked at the holographic display, where the blue markers of the human campaign were spreading like a wound across the galaxy. "Stars, forgive me. I had no idea what I was vouching for." Below on Platform 16, Voss allowed herself one small moment. She looked at her team, her 6 people, her tiny, impossible team, and gave a single nod. "Good work, now let us finish this." On Platform 1, the Velthari Hive commander had stopped watching his own abandoned campaign entirely. He had ordered his officers to record every move the humans made, every decision, every order. He understood now that this was no longer a competition. This was the most important intelligence-gathering operation in Velthari history. 40 minutes into the simulation, and the Scourge tide was dying. The central holographic display told the story in simple colors. Blue had swallowed most of the galaxy. The red stain of the Scourge, once a massive empire stretching across an entire spiral arm, had been pushed back into a tight, desperate cluster around its core worlds. 60% of its territory was gone. Its fleets were shattered. Its factory worlds were burning or blockaded or turned into traps that killed anything that came near them. On Platform 16, the humans worked with the quiet focus of surgeons in an operating room. No shouting, no celebration, just calm voices passing information and the steady tap of fingers on controls. But the Scourge AI had one final weapon. The Harrow contingency scenario had been designed with a built-in escalation, a doomsday device called the Convergence Engine. It was a superweapon of enormous power, capable of destroying an entire sector of space in a single blast. In the simulation's intended timeline, the Scourge was supposed to deploy it in year 10, as a final desperate act after a long, grinding war. It was meant to be the ultimate test, a sudden catastrophe that forced teams to adapt or die after years of hard-won progress. But the humans had not given the Scourge 10 years. They had compressed the entire war into a fraction of the expected time. The AI's loss conditions were being met so fast that its programming triggered the convergence engine early. The doomsday weapon activated in Year 8 instead of Year 10. Warning lights flooded the central display. A massive energy signature appeared in the heart of Scourge space, a weapon charging, building power, preparing to fire. Every team's display flashed red with emergency alerts. The gallery fell into horrified silence. The convergence engine fired. A beam of white light tore across the holographic galaxy. It hit the Candris sector, a cluster of 12 star systems that the humans had captured in their opening push. The display went blank in that area. When it reformed, the sector was gone. Not conquered, not damaged, erased. 12 systems, billions of simulated lives, and an entire human battle fleet annihilated in an instant. The gallery gasped. Several alien officers covered their eyes. The Urani ambassador made a sound like a wounded animal. On Platform 3, the Draxi warlord commander shook his head slowly. He had seen this weapon-end simulation runs before. It was designed to break spirits, to take away everything a team had fought for and leave them staring at ashes. On Platform 16, Captain Mara Voss did not react. She did not gasp. She did not flinch. She did not even pause. She continued entering commands into her console at the same steady pace as if nothing had happened. Because for her, nothing unexpected had happened. Ghost pulled up a data screen and confirmed what the rest of the team already knew. Candris sector is empty. All essential assets were relocated 3 minutes ago. We lost 2 scout ships and a communications relay. 3 real-time minutes before the weapon fired, Voss had ordered a complete evacuation of the Candris sector. Every warship, every transport, every valuable piece of equipment had been pulled out. She had left behind only empty stations and skeleton crews of automated drones. The Scourge's greatest weapon had destroyed nothing but ghosts. In the gallery, Commander Vorson turned to one of his officers. She knew, he said. His voice was flat with disbelief. She knew the weapon was coming. His officer checked the human team's command logs. She began evacuation procedures at the 37-minute mark. The weapon did not begin charging until the 39-minute mark. She ordered the evacuation 2 minutes before there was any sign of the weapon activating. Vorson's mandibles went still. She had not reacted to the weapon. She had predicted it. She had looked at the simulation's design, understood how the AI would think when it was desperate, calculated when and where the superweapon would fire, and moved her people out of the way before the threat even existed. This was not strategy, this was prophecy. But Voss was not finished. The convergence engine had fired, and now it needed time to recharge. Ghost had tracked the weapon's energy signature during the blast and had calculated its exact cooldown period, 14 simulated days before it could fire again. 14 days. In human military thinking, that was not a window, that was an invitation. Voss turned to Shankar. The debris field from the Candris blast, what is the residual energy output? Shankar ran the numbers in seconds. Her eyes went wide, and then she smiled the kind of smile that made alien species want to leave the room. It is enormous. The blast left enough ambient energy in that sector to power a small sun. If we set up resonance collectors, we could channel it into a focused energy corridor. Could you build a temporary faster-than-light beacon with it? Shankar stared at her captain. You want to use their own weapons leftovers to open a door behind their lines. Can you do it? Give me 4 simulated hours. Voss gave her 6. In those 6 simulated hours, Shankar's engineering teams worked at a speed that the simulation's designers had never anticipated. They harvested energy from the debris of the Scourge's own superweapon, constructed a makeshift FTL beacon, and opened a short-range jump corridor that deposited the entire human battle fleet directly behind the Scourge's core defensive network. The Scourge had spent centuries building those defenses. Layer upon layer of weapon platforms, mine fields, sensor grids, and fortress stations designed to stop any fleet from reaching their homeworlds. They were the most formidable defensive lines in the simulation, tested against hundreds of teams over 200 years. The humans did not fight through them. The humans appeared behind them, as if the defenses did not exist. The Scourge's core command nexus, the beating heart of the AI's war machine, was suddenly exposed, undefended, and surrounded. Voss gave the order. The human fleet attacked from every direction at once. The command nexus, a structure the size of a small moon, was destroyed in 11 simulated minutes. The Scourge tide began to collapse. Without its central command, individual fleets lost coordination. Factory worlds stopped producing ships. Defense networks went dark. The great red stain on the holographic display began to fade, system by system, world by world, like blood washing away in rain. But Voss did not accept the AI's surrender protocols. When the simulation offered her the option to accept the Scourge's capitulation, she declined. Her fleet continued hunting. Every remaining Scourge ship, every hidden base, every dormant factory was found and destroyed. A proctor contacted her platform. "Captain Voss, the enemy has offered surrender. Standard procedure is to accept and proceed to the resolution phase." Voss did not look up from her display. Standard procedure assumes the enemy cannot learn from survivors. This AI adapts. If I leave a single ship intact, it will analyze what happened and prepare counters. I am not fighting this war twice. She continued until there was nothing left. Not a single red marker remained on the display. On Platform 7, the Draxi warlord commander, a veteran of real wars, a species famous across the galaxy for their love of battle and their willingness to use force without hesitation, set down his command tablet gently on his console. His second-in-command looked at him with concern. "Commander, are you well?" The old Draxi was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful, a tone his subordinate had never heard from him before. "I have spent my life believing the Draxi understood war. I was wrong. We understand violence. We understand rage and strength and the joy of crushing an enemy." He looked at Platform 16, where Voss was calmly reviewing her final operations. "That woman understands war, real war, the kind that does not end until the enemy is not just defeated but erased. The kind that is not fought with anger but with patience and mathematics, and a willingness to do whatever is necessary, no matter how terrible." He paused. "We are not warriors, we are brawlers. She is a warrior." High Arbiter Drelon, sitting in his ancient seat above the chamber, opened a private communication channel to Ambassador Yilling. He asked one question, his deep voice carrying the weight of 200 years of watching species fight. "How many wars has their species fought among themselves?" Yilling was quiet for several seconds. "We stopped counting," she finally said. "Their historians estimate thousands. They have been at war with each other for their entire recorded history, sometimes dozens of wars at the same time." Drelon said nothing. He closed the channel and sat in silence, his bark-like face unreadable. The humans had not become great warriors by fighting aliens. They had become great warriors by fighting each other, endlessly, ruthlessly, for thousands of years. Every strategy Voss had used, every trick, every doctrine, all of it had been developed, tested, refined, and perfected against the most dangerous enemy humanity had ever faced. Themselves. The simulation ended without fanfare. There was no dramatic final explosion, no last desperate battle, no cinematic moment of triumph. The last red marker on the holographic display simply blinked once and disappeared, and the galaxy went quiet. The Scourge tide, the enemy that had broken armies and shattered records for 200 years, was gone. The final timestamp appeared on the central display in clean, white numbers that every species in the room could read. 54 minutes, 33 seconds. The grand simulation chamber, packed with the finest military minds of 16 species and hundreds of observers in the gallery above, was completely silent. Not the respectful silence of admiration, not the heavy silence of defeat. This was the silence of creatures who had just watched something they could not fully understand, something that had shifted the ground beneath their feet in ways they would spend years trying to process. Captain Mara Voss powered down her console. She stretched her neck, rolled her shoulders, and turned to her team. "Good work, everyone. Clean run." Her voice was calm and conversational, as if she had just finished a morning exercise, instead of destroying a galactic empire in less than an hour. Ghost was already reviewing his notes. He had a small frown on his face, not the frown of dissatisfaction, but the focused expression of a man looking for errors in his own work. He found 2 moments where he felt his analysis had been too slow and marked them for later review. Shankar pulled a protein bar from her pocket and bit into it. She chewed thoughtfully, looking at the now-empty holographic display, and said, "I think the FTL beacon trick could have been 10% more efficient if I had redirected the third resonance collector differently." Lieutenant Park shook his head. "We just broke a 200-year record by a factor of about 1,000, and you are worried about 10%. Shankar shrugged. 10% is 10%. In the gallery, the Urani ambassador was weeping silently. Her diplomatic attaché handed her a cloth to dry her membrane-covered eyes, unsure whether the tears were from awe, fear, or some combination of both that the Urani language did not have a word for. The Draxi delegation stood in rigid silence. Their commander had not moved since putting down his tablet. His officers waited for him to speak, to process what they had seen, to give them context. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Velthari Hive commander finally looked away from Platform 16 and faced his own officers. They stared at him with their compound eyes, waiting. He reached over and deleted every file from their own abandoned simulation campaign. "None of this matters anymore," he said quietly. "Everything we thought we knew about warfare is wrong." High Arbiter Draylan rose from his seat. This simple action drew every eye in the chamber. The ancient Korath moved slowly, his bark-covered limbs creaking as he descended from the gallery to the chamber floor. He walked to the center of the room, his roots scraping against the polished metal, and stood before the holographic display. His voice, when he spoke, filled the chamber like the sound of wind through a forest. "The 30-second grand simulation is complete. The Harrow contingency has been resolved by the team representing Earth, under the command of Captain Mara Voss, in a time of 54 minutes and 33 seconds. He paused. The weight of what he was about to say settled over the room. The previous record of 4.2 galactic years, held by the Velthari Hive Command for 80 years, is surpassed. Another pause, longer this time. In my capacity as High Arbiter, I award the human team the Axiom Wreath, the highest honor of the grand simulation." Voss stepped forward and accepted the award, a small crystalline structure that pulsed with soft light, with a polite nod and a simple, "Thank you, Arbiter. It was an honor to participate." Draylan looked at her for a long moment, then he spoke again. "In 200 years of service, I have never found it necessary to create a new designation for any team or any performance. Today, I find it necessary. Let the record show that the human team's achievement is classified as peerless. This designation indicates a performance that is not merely superior to previous records, but exists in a category of its own, separate and apart from all that came before." The word hung in the air, peerless, without equal, without comparison. A word that meant the old records were not just broken, they were made meaningless. The ceremony ended. The delegations began to file out. Some moved quickly, eager to return to their quarters and process what they had witnessed. Others lingered, watching the humans with expressions that ranged from admiration to barely concealed terror. Shankar, protein bar finished, wandered over to a group of Urani engineers who had been watching from the lower gallery. She started talking to them about energy field harmonics with the cheerful enthusiasm of someone discussing a hobby. The Urani engineers listened with the wide-eyed attention of small animals caught in an open field, unable to decide whether to run or stay very still. Ghost had already left the chamber. He found a quiet corridor, sat on a bench, and began writing a detailed report of every decision made during the simulation, including a section titled Errors and Missed Opportunities that was, remarkably, longer than the section titled Successful Actions. He planned to have it ready for the team's review session by evening. Park, Akafer, and Reeves headed for the station's mess hall, talking casually about what to eat. Reeves wanted noodles. Akafer argued for grilled meat. Park suggested they could get both. The most devastating military performance in galactic history had left them with no stronger emotion than hunger. Voss remained in the chamber for a few minutes, speaking with Arbiter Draylon about the simulation's design. She was complimentary and specific. She praised the AI's adaptive algorithms, noted the clever placement of resource nodes, and suggested that the convergence engine's trigger conditions might benefit from being less predictable in future iterations. Draylon listened with the careful attention of someone being given notes by a master. It was in the corridor outside the chamber, 20 minutes after the simulation ended, that Commander Vorson found her. He had been standing there, waiting, gathering the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since the 12th minute. Voss walked out alone, her crystalline award tucked under her arm, and nearly walked past him before he spoke. "Captain Voss." She stopped and turned. "Commander Vorson, thank you for running an excellent event. Your staff was very professional." He looked at her. She was so small, shorter than him by a full body length, thin and fragile-looking, with soft skin that could be cut by a sharp edge and bones that could be broken by a moderate fall. She was made of water and carbon and not much else. She came from a world of earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, predators, parasites, and a star that gave her cancer if she stood in its light too long. Everything about her body was temporary and breakable. And she had just dismantled a war that was designed to be unwinnable. "Captain," he said, and the question cost him more pride than he had ever spent in his life. "In your honest assessment, was the simulation difficult?" Voss looked at him. She studied his face, his compound eyes, his clicking mandibles, the stiff set of his forearms. She recognized the courage it had taken for him to ask, and she respected him enough not to give him a comfortable lie. "The starting position was inconvenient," she said. "The AI was clever for about 6 minutes. The superweapon was a nice surprise. We had expected it around year 9, not year 8. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But difficult. No, Commander, it was not difficult, and I think I understand why." Vorson waited. This simulation was designed by people who have never lost everything and had to claw it back with their bare hands. It was built to test species who fight to survive. And that is a reasonable thing to test, because for most species, survival is the goal of war. She met his eyes, her two soft, brown, impossibly calm eyes meeting his dozens of dark, fractured lenses. "Humans do not fight to survive. We figured out surviving a long time ago. Every flood, every famine, every ice age, every extinction event our world threw at us. We survived all of it before we ever built our first city. Survival is not our challenge. It is our starting point." She shifted the crystal award under her arm. "We fight to win. And there is a very large difference between a species that fights because it is afraid to die and a species that fights because it refuses to lose. Your simulation tested the first kind. It was never built for the second." She nodded to him once politely and walked away down the corridor. Her boots made soft, steady sounds on the metal floor. She did not hurry. She did not slow down. She moved with the even pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, because wherever she went, she had already won. Vorsan stood alone in the empty corridor. His mandibles clicked once, twice, in that ancient pattern his species could not control. The pattern that meant danger. The pattern that meant predator. The pattern that had been coded into Velthari genetics 1,000,000 years ago, when his ancestors hid in the dark and prayed that the thing hunting them would pass by. He activated his private communication channel to the Velthari Hive Council. His message was brief. He had spent 30 years as a military officer, and he had never sent a message with greater urgency or greater sincerity. 2 words: befriend them. He closed the channel and stood there for a long time, staring down the empty corridor where the human had walked, listening to the fatting sound of her footsteps. Across Axiom Prime, in quarters and meeting rooms and mess halls, the representatives of 400 species were arriving at the same conclusion through different paths. The Urani were already drafting new diplomatic overtures to Earth. The Draxi were quietly restructuring their entire military doctrine. The Velthari were copying every byte of data they had recorded. Smaller species, the ones who had barely noticed the humans arrive that morning, were frantically searching their databases for everything they could find about the planet called Earth and the strange, soft, breakable creatures who lived on it. A single truth settled over the galactic community that day, quiet and heavy, like ash falling after a fire that had burned everything to the horizon. The Deathworlders had not come to the Galactic Union to join the existing order. They had not come to learn from the galaxy's ancient civilizations, or to earn their place among species that had sailed between stars, while humans were still hitting each other with sharpened rocks. They had come to remind the galaxy what war actually looked like. And for the first time in 10,000 years of recorded galactic history, every species with the capacity for fear shared the same unspoken thought. They were not afraid of the humans at war. They were afraid of what the humans would do when they ran out of wars to fight.